June 1944. Japanese radar operators spot the impossible, an enormous, gleaming bomber soaring higher than any enemy has dared before. In that instant, pilots scramble to intercept what looks like a silver fortress swallowing the sky. But as their engines choke on thin air and their guns freeze above 30,000 feet, it becomes clear. The B-29 Superfortress is something no doctrine, no Zero, no flak tower can touch. Pilots and commanders are left stunned, grasping at outdated tactics as Japan's defenses crumble in the face of industrial warfare. How did the arrival of one bomber shatter a nation's confidence and signal a new, terrifying age in the skies? Radio chatter erupted as sirens wailed through Yawata's narrow streets. On the ground, factory workers and schoolchildren craned their necks, searching the midday sky for the source of the alarm. Controllers at the local air defense post struggled to make sense of the radar blips, each echo tracing a path far higher than any previous enemy flight. Reports filtered in from lookouts, a formation of immense silver bombers, sunlight flashing off their wings, moving with slow, deliberate confidence across the blue. For a moment, disbelief held the city. Civilians whispered about a new kind of plane, too large to be real, too high to fear. Pilots scrambled to their cockpits, engines coughing to life as orders barked over the radio. But as fighters clawed upward, oxygen dials flickered and engines groaned in protest. At 9,000 meters, the thin air bit hard, guns froze, vision blurred, and the B-29 still hung above, untouched. One pilot's diary would later read, "We could climb for a few short minutes, but our engines choked and guns iced over. The vast plane crawled across the sky, almost untouchable." In control rooms, officers thumbed through manuals, searching for answers that didn't exist. The old rules, quick climbs, tight turns, low-altitude chases, meant nothing now. Each minute the bombers circled overhead, the gap between expectation and reality widened. For the first time, both defenders and civilians faced an enemy that seemed to rewrite the very logic of air defense. Japanese air defense doctrine in 1944 was anchored in a world that no longer existed. Staff officers, trained on years of low-altitude raids and short-range duels, filled their manuals with diagrams showing agile fighters intercepting lumbering bombers at 5,000 or 6,000 meters. Radar stations, Type 2. Mark II sets ringing Tokyo and the industrial belt could spot incoming planes at up to 8,000 or 9,000 meters, but struggled to track anything higher. On paper, the system seemed tight. Early warning posts reported to regional commands, anti-aircraft batteries layered their fire, and squadrons of Ki-43s and Zeros waited at dispersal fields. In practice, the cracks ran deep. Flak batteries, armed with Type 88 and Type 99 mine guns, were tuned for bursts below 7,500 meters. Their fuses set in 500-meter steps, rarely adjusted for anything higher. Fighter scramble orders assumed attackers would never appear above 8,000 meters, and oxygen systems were rated for 10,000 meters, but often failed well before that in real combat. Radar coverage left wide gaps over mountain valleys and coastal approaches, and the entire doctrine depended on quick, coordinated action, something fuel shortages and patchy communications made almost impossible. Manuals still instructed crews to intercept in tight spirals and short climbs, a tactic rendered useless by bombers that soared far above the reach of both guns and engines. For staff planners, the B-29's altitude and speed were not just technical challenges, they exposed the limits of an entire defensive philosophy. Ki-43 pilots launched in waves, straining every system as they climbed into air thinner than any had faced before. At 25,000 feet, the cockpit windows frosted and oxygen masks pressed tight against skin, but the world outside only grew more distant. Engine temperatures crept toward the red, needles quivering as mechanics on the ground listened for the telltale sputter of a failing cylinder. Above 8,000 meters, the promise of interception faded. Propellers lost bite, fuel mixtures ran thin, and the sky itself seemed to squeeze the life from every machine. Guns jammed as lubricants thickened in the cold, and the few bursts fired at the silver bombers vanished into empty space. Pilots scribbled notes on kneeboards, hands shaking from cold and lack of air. One diary entry described the final moments of a climb. Vision narrowed, breath shallow. I saw the enemy, but my arms felt heavy, and the controls would not answer. Some managed a fleeting glimpse of the B-29's broad wings before dropping away, engines coughing, faces tinged with blue. The theoretical ceiling of 29,000 feet existed only in manuals, rarely, if ever, reached in combat. Each sortie ended with exhausted men slumping in their cockpits, haunted by the memory of unreachable contrails and the realization that courage alone could not close the gap. Inside each B-29, a new kind of defense waited, a system more at home in a laboratory than a bomber's fuselage. 5 turrets, each controlled remotely by gunners seated behind thick glass or blister domes, formed a web of overlapping fire. The heart of this defense was the General Electric Central Fire Control System, an analog computer that digested range, speed, angle, and wind, then spat out precise aiming commands to the .50 caliber guns. Gunners worked in pairs, one tracking through a sight, the other ready to take over if a station failed. If a gunner spotted a fighter diving in from the nose, the computer calculated the lead instantly, swinging the forward turret to intercept. If that gunner went down, another could assume control with the flip of a switch. No need to crawl through the pressurized tunnel under fire. For Japanese pilots, the first attack runs felt like suicide. Approaching from the front or tail, they faced a curtain of bullets, each burst guided by predictive data rather than guesswork. Formation flying turned every B-29 into a fortress, their turrets covering each other's blind spots, so that a single fighter might draw fire from 3 bombers at once. After-action reports from the Yawata raid show most fighters broke off before closing to 400 yards, the lethal zone where the B-29's guns were most accurate and the Japanese cannons could do real damage. Training films later recovered in Japan warned pilots, "Do not attack from the rear. Losses will be heavy." Inside the bombers, gunners compared their work to a video game, hands dancing over switches as analog dials spun. But the stakes were real. Every second, they juggled turret transfers, tracked blips racing across their sights, and relied on the system's redundancy to keep all arcs covered. The result was a defensive gauntlet that turned traditional attack tactics upside down, leaving attackers stunned and often outgunned before they ever fired a shot. The B-29 Superfortress arrived in the Pacific with an arsenal of innovations that left engineers and pilots on both sides questioning what was possible in the air. At the heart of its power were 4 Wright R-3350 twin-row radial engines, each fitted with turbo-superchargers that gulped thin air and kept the giant bomber cruising at over 350 miles per hour, even above 30,000 feet. This wasn't just a matter of speed. Turbo-supercharging let the B-29 hold altitude where most fighters sputtered and fell away. Instead of losing power as the air thinned, the engines surged on, their exhausts glowing against the stratosphere. Inside, the pressurized cabin was a revelation. Crews operated in shirt sleeves, while Japanese pilots, climbing to interception heights, struggled with frozen controls and oxygen-starved lungs. The B-29's sealed compartments allowed gunners, navigators, and bombardiers to work efficiently for hours at altitudes that would leave most men gasping. For the first time, a bomber's range and altitude weren't limited by the endurance of its crew, but by the capacity of its fuel tanks and bomb bays. With a combat radius of 1,500 miles, the B-29 could strike from distant island bases across the Pacific, leapfrogging geography that once protected the Japanese home islands. No other bomber in the world could carry 20,000 pounds of bombs from so far away and return with fuel to spare. Range charts drawn up in American planning rooms now covered the entire Japanese archipelago in overlapping circles. Geography, once Japan's shield, had been rendered meaningless by engineering. For defenders, the sky itself seemed to belong to the Superfortress. At dusk on June 15, 1944, the 58th Bombardment Wing launched from Chengdu, China, each B-29 heavy with fuel and hope. 75 Superfortresses set out, but only 47 managed to drop their loads near the Imperial Iron and Steel Works at Yawata. The raid, planned for months, was supposed to cripple a vital link in Japan's war machine. Instead, scattered bomb impacts and poor visibility meant the coke ovens, the target's heart, survived almost untouched. Reconnaissance photos days later showed little more than scorched earth and a few twisted girders, not the industrial collapse U.S. planners had predicted. Japanese defenders scrambled in confusion. Ki-45 night fighters clawed for altitude, oxygen systems straining, engines threatening to seize. Only a handful of pilots even reached bomber altitude, and just one, Warrant Officer Sadamitsu Kimura, managed to bring down a B-29, the Limber Dragon, in a brief, violent encounter. Flak crews fired blindly into the night sky, their shells bursting thousands of feet below the bombers. 6 Superfortresses limped home with damage, but the vast majority returned unscathed, their crews shaken more by mechanical failures and the long journey than by enemy action. On the ground, the raid's physical toll was minor, but its psychological shock was immense. Local papers described the event as proof that Japan's heartland was now exposed. In Tokyo, staff officers pored over after-action reports, uneasy with the realization that a new era of warfare had arrived. The old confidence in geography and doctrine had vanished overnight. For the Americans, even with limited damage, the mission proved the B-29 could reach Japan's core. For the Japanese, Yawata was a warning, the sky was no longer theirs. Desperation crept into every command post as the B-29's altitude and firepower shattered old assumptions. Within weeks of the Yawata raid, Japanese planners rushed the Ki-44 Shoki and later the Ki-84 Hayate into frontline service, machines built for speed and climb, their engines tuned for brief, violent sprints toward the stratosphere. Pilots, many barely out of training, were briefed on new tactics. One pass at maximum throttle, fire at will, then dive away before the gunners could lock on. For some, even this was not enough. Orders circulated for tai-atari, ramming attacks. Squadrons gathered for farewell photographs, men writing final letters home before taking off with explicit instructions to crash into the enemy if all else failed. Interception manuals were rewritten on the fly. Climb profiles for the Ki-44 called for full emergency power, oxygen wide open, guns loaded with every available round. But the thin air above 9,000 meters punished both machine and man. Engine failures mounted, oxygen systems froze or leaked. In the chaos, a handful of pilots managed to close within firing range, loosing bursts of 20mm shells before breaking away, but most attacks fell short or went unanswered. Flak batteries, desperate for relevance, received shipments of new Sanshiki shells, high-explosive rounds designed to burst at higher altitude, but the majority still detonated far below the bomber's path, their black puffs marking only frustration. After each raid, casualty lists grew. Aircraft lost to engine fires, pilots missing after failed ramming attempts, anti-aircraft crews scolded for wasting ammunition. Memoirs from the period describe a growing sense of futility, orders to intercept, knowing the odds, knowing the cost. Every sortie chipped away at experience and morale, leaving fewer veterans to teach the next wave. In the face of the Superfortress, bravery became a currency spent with little hope of return. In early March 1945, a new voice took command of the B-29 campaign. Major General Curtis LeMay, a hard-charging tactician, ordered crews to strip their bombers of most defensive guns and fly at night, low and fast, across the blacked-out sprawl of Tokyo. The old doctrine of high-altitude precision had delivered little, scattered craters, factories still running. Now, incendiary bombs would do the work. Crews loaded up with M69s, small, napalm-filled canisters designed to ignite wood and paper, the bones of every Japanese city. On the night of March 9th, 334 superfortresses thundered off from the Marianas, each packed with nearly 8 tons of fire. They arrived over Tokyo just before midnight, dropping their cargo in wide overlapping patterns. The M69s burst open on rooftops, spraying burning gel that clung to everything it touched. Within minutes, the city's eastern wards became a single, roaring inferno. Winds whipped the flames into firestorms, strong enough to rip doors from hinges and pull oxygen from the lungs of anyone trying to flee. Police estimates later counted over 100,000 dead, but the devastation was measured in blocks, 16 square miles of Tokyo erased in a single night. B-29 losses were almost non-existent. Just one bomber failed to return. In the weeks that followed, Osaka, Nagoya, and Kobe burned in turn. Bomber crews watched entire neighborhoods vanish below, the glow visible from 150 miles away. For many, the only threat was mechanical failure, not enemy action. The air war had become an industrial process, calculated, relentless, and almost impossible to resist. The sound came first, a low, distant hum that seeped through blackout curtains and narrow alleys, growing louder with each night. Families huddled in cramped shelters, clutching radios tuned to emergency bulletins, waiting for the all-clear that rarely came. Air raid wardens patrolled the streets, faces drawn, and voices hoarse from shouting warnings. In Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and dozens of smaller cities, police logs filled with reports of panicked crowds, stampedes toward rivers, and entire neighborhoods vanishing in firestorms. The B-29's deep vibration became a signal of helplessness, a sound that meant running was futile. Pilots returned from failed intercepts, uniforms soaked in sweat, eyes hollow from exhaustion. Some never bothered to remove their flight gear, sleeping in cockpits for fear of missing the next scramble. Volunteer ranks thinned as men deserted or simply stopped reporting for duty. Diaries from the spring of 1945 speak of sleepless nights and a city that never truly darkened, glows on the horizon marking new losses. For many, hope faded with each passing raid. The sky no longer offered protection, it brought only dread. In homes, shelters, and command posts, resignation set in. The war's outcome now seemed to hang on forces no one could touch. At dawn on August 6, 1945, a single B-29 named Enola Gay lifted off from Tinian, carrying a bomb unlike any before. The aircraft, stripped of all but its tailgun and fitted with silverplate modifications, climbed to 31,000 feet. Its target, Hiroshima, lay quiet beneath a summer haze. At 8:15 a.m., the crew released Little Boy, a 9,700-pound uranium device set to detonate in midair. The blast erased nearly 70% of the city, killing an estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people instantly. Fires raged, and survivors staggered through a ruined landscape, blinded by a flash brighter than the sun. 3 days later, Boxcar, another silverplate B-29, reached Nagasaki after a harrowing search for a clear target. At 11:01 a.m. on August 9th, Fat Man, a 10,800-pound plutonium bomb, detonated above the city. The explosion claimed 40,000 lives within moments, with the toll rising to nearly 80,000 by year's end. Japanese air defense, crippled and confused, failed to respond in time. No fighters intercepted, no flak reached the bombers. The Superfortress had delivered the final blow from an altitude no defender could touch, ending the air war with a force that stunned the world. In June 1944, 75 B-29 bombers struck Yawata, marking the first time Japan's mainland faced high-altitude, long-range attacks. Japanese pilots and commanders, equipped for low and medium altitudes, found their tactics and technology suddenly obsolete. The B-29's remote-controlled turrets, 30,000-foot ceiling, and 350-mile-per-hour speed meant that traditional interception methods failed, even as Japan fielded new fighters and ordered ramming attacks. By 1945, firebombing raids like the one that destroyed 16 square miles of Tokyo showed the overwhelming impact of American industrial power. What remains clear is that the arrival of the B-29 signaled a turning point. Technical innovation and mass production could decide the fate of nations. The end of World War II in the Pacific was shaped not just by courage, but by the era's most advanced machines.